at just this juncture, then perhaps I can reasonably expect or even confidently believe that a miracle will happen in a given case, that Superman will somehow arrive to save Lois Lane, that Abraham and Sarah will conceive despite their age, that the normal causal powers of Nebuchadnezzar's furnace fire will not affect Abednego, and so forth. If one can reasonably expect or believe in such a case, then it certainly seems reasonable, if a bit weak-minded, to hope. We can use a ceteris paribus clause to isolate our intuitions here. Other things being equal, and setting aside any background beliefs about supernatural beings, is it reasonable to hope that the dead relative will rise to meet us tomorrow, or that I can fly around the conference room just by flapping my arms? It is clearly more common simply to want such things than it is to hope for them, though our friends would worry if we were to invest a lot of emotional energy even in just desiring them. That said, it is also more typical to hope for such things than it is to believe or weakly opine that they will occur, believe in the contemporary sense. So this seems to be an instance in which the rationality conditions on hope diverge from assertoric categorical kinds of judgment and go instead with desire or wish. That doesn't mean that hope is just the same thing as desire or wish, however. You can certainly rationally desire or wish for something if you are certain that it did, will, or did not, or will not obtain. But you can't always rationally hope for such a thing. What about the converse, the causally necessary? So that was the causally impossible. The causally necessary, the sun will warm the earth tomorrow, the apple will fall when it drops from the tree, the magnets will attract one another, so forth. If I don't know that it's causally necessary that the sun will warm the earth tomorrow, I can reasonably hope that it will. So there's a kind of epistemic access constraint there. But what if I know that it's determined? Can I still reasonably hope that it will happen? My own sense is that I can't do that, since here, even more so than in the case of the probable, something stronger, full-blown expectation, is justified. So that kind of assert the stronger rule, adopt the stronger. Someone might point out here that an acceptable response to the question, will the sun warm the earth tomorrow, could be something like, well, I certainly hope so. But here I think the speaker is reporting a much weaker state than she actually has in order to implicate something about the silliness of the question. The speaker asserts something that would be more appropriate if the object in question were a causal improbability. I hope so. But intones her response in a way that draws attention to the fact that the questioner is asking something to which he should already know the answer. So I think this isn't really a violation of the assert or adopt the stronger attitude rule mentioned earlier. Interestingly, on the Leibnizian picture, there might be more room for rational hope for causal necessities than there is on a view according to which natural laws have genuine efficacy. For Leibniz, recall, the normal order of things is characterized by what in the discourse he calls the subordinate maxims of God's will, and what in later works are just called laws of nature. These are the uniform principles that we rely on in everyday life and seek to approximate in our empirical science. But whereas he once thought of these as geometrically necessary, by the time of the discourse, 1768, Leibniz is convinced that there is this higher, quote, universal law of the general order, the law of the series, that describes the way the world is actually arranged. This principle is wholly inscrutable to us for reasons Leibniz doesn't fully explain, and which in a way seem somewhat in tension with Don Rutherford's principle of intelligibility. I mean, we were sort of discussing this during his session this morning. The gap between these two principles is the place where the genuine miracles fit in, those miracles of the highest order, that he calls them, that surpass all the powers of the limited natures. Included among these are the divine acts such as creation, concurrence, incarnation, and annihilation. About the miracles that are not of the highest order, he seems sympathetic to the idea that other finite creatures might be involved, angels and so forth, I guess. So those don't end up being violations of the subordinate maxims, I think. So for Leibniz from 1768 onwards, what is causally necessary is not really necessary at all. It is simply what follows from the subordinate maxims, and so there may still be reason to hope that it obtains. Indeed, given that the annihilation of souls is a miracle of the first order, it may seem rational for those of us who are fond of our existence to hope that the causally necessary thing here occurs rather than a miracle such as this one. On the other hand, given that Leibniz also indicates that concurrence is a miracle of the first order, and it's very difficult to figure out exactly how this is supposed to work, but agreeing with him that concurrence is supposed to be a miracle of the first order, it looks like those of us who are fond of existence can reasonably hope for what is, strictly speaking, causally impossible. That is, impossible for finite substances given the laws and the subordinate maxims. So with Leibniz, it gets a little bit strange regarding the causally impossible and the causally necessary and what might be rationally hope-worthy. I'm going to skip a bunch of other sections where I talk about different modalities and their relationship to rational hope, and just suggest to you that this armchair analysis would show that there is an important epistemic access constraint on hope. We can hope for things that are necessary or impossible in a stronger than causal sense, even if we know that they have this modal status, as long as we don't know which of the two options obtain. If both the world and the mind are settled, then it's not rational, I submit, to hope one way or the other. In such a case, the most we can rationally do is to expect that the thing will happen, or perhaps wish that the thing will not happen. So if the world and the mind are settled, that is, if it's already determined that this will occur and we know that it is, then it looks like rational hope falls away. Another upshot here is that there's at least one important necessary condition on rational hope. We can rationally hope that P only if P describes an event or state of affairs that we do not have justification for believing to be really or metaphysically impossible. If we know or even justifiably believe that it's metaphysically impossible, then we can't reasonably hope that it will obtain. Our results also suggest that there's a reason to steer clear of formulations that focus solely on epistemic possibilities, such as the one on your handout. S is hope that P is rational only if for all S knows P. That's the first kind of rejected principle on the handout. The reason I think we should avoid this in the case of hoping for a miracle is that the subject may well know, at least in some reliablest sense, that not P in a given case, and yet still hope that P. For example, given the causal laws, I may well know that the ice cream cone that just slipped out of my hand will fall down into the gorge in Ithaca and be lost forever, but at the same time hope that it will defy gravity and somehow come back up into my grasp. So, I mean, this is right on a certain reliablest notion of knowledge, although it doesn't, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, it doesn't sound right that you can know that P and still hope that not P. But in the example, we certainly know enough about the causal laws, say, to know that the ice cream cone's going to fall and be lost forever, and yet at the same time hope that it will defy gravity and come back up into my grasp. Of course, if what I have is knowledge in the first place, then my hopes will ultimately be dashed along with the ice cream cone. Knowledge is factive. But that needn't entail that they are irrational hopes. The same sorts of considerations work against a slightly weaker principle, two pound signs there on the handout. S is hope that P is rational only if for all S is justified in believing P. That's just slightly weakened, taking the knowledge and making it justified belief. So I think the necessary, and note that this is only a necessary condition. The necessary condition on rational hope that we should endorse here then is something in the region of principle H. S is hope that P is rational only if for all S is justified in believing P is metaphysically possible. So you can see that's importantly weaker and avoids some of these counterexamples. Okay, let's turn back to Kant. In the passage from the Canon of Pure Reason mentioned at the outset, Kant tells us that all interests of reason are united in the three questions about knowledge, ethical action, and religious hope. The third question, he goes on to say, is, quote, simultaneously practical and theoretical, so that the practical leads like a clue to a reply to the theoretical questions, and in its highest form, the speculative question. In other words, by reflecting on the fact that something ought to happen, we can make inferences about what we may hope to be true, even if we can't know that it is true or even possible. Kant here goes on to describe the perfect moral world, a world in which everyone does his duty perfectly, and thus one in which human freedom and the moral law are in perfect accord. The real possibility of such a world, he says, is a condition, given the ought implies can principle of its being the case, that everyone ought always to will the moral law. And so, Kant says, when we will the moral law, impersonally, as binding on all rational beings, we implicitly accept that a moral world is or was really possible. We can't rationally hope for a fully moral world anymore, however. I mean, we sort of know that this one isn't a perfectly moral world where everyone does his duty. But we can and should still hope for what he calls a just world. So no longer considering a moral, perfect world, but what he calls a just world. Kant says here that, and this is your first quotation, it is equally necessary to accept, in accordance with reason in its theoretical use, that everyone has grounds to hope for happiness in the same measure as he has made himself worthy of it in his conduct, and that the system of morality is therefore inseparably combined with the system of happiness, though only in the idea of pure reason. So the just world is one in which happiness and virtue are in perfect proportion. That would be true of the moral world as well. It's just that there everyone would be perfectly moral and therefore perfectly happy. This is an odd phrase, except that everyone has grounds to hope. Given the practical context of the discussion, it looks as though acceptance here is going to be belief in the technical Kantian sense. And indeed, Kant, as I said, treats these terms often as synonymous. What we're accepting then is that everyone has grounds to hope for happiness in proportion to his own virtue. We're not baldly accepting that there actually is a necessary connection between virtue and happiness. Rather, we're accepting that such a connection is really possible from a practical point of view, and then hoping that it's actual. So we're believing that it's really possible and then hoping that it's actual, in our case as well as in that of others. Kant goes on to claim contentiously that God's actual existence as well as that of the future life for the human soul are necessary conditions of the real possibility of such a necessary connection, and thus that the very willing of the moral law requires that we adopt a belief in God and a future life. Those last moves are familiar and very controversial. I don't propose to make any more than a few brief remarks about them here. First, note again that Kant doesn't say that we can hope for the existence of a moral world. This shows that he's taking into account the conclusive evidence that we have in our own case as well as others that this is not a moral world. It's not a world in which everyone is perfectly virtuous. Hope that the past would be different is hope for a kind of impossibility. Freddoso and others following certain medievals call it an accidental necessity, the past, rather than sort of full-blown metaphysical necessity, but necessity all the same. Still, we can hold out hope of being happy, Kant says, in this other thing, the just world, and thus hope that our own ultimate moral state is one of righteousness rather than radical evil. Most significant for our purposes is that Kant is clearly operating here with a stronger condition on hope than the one that came out of the analysis in section 2 above. Our conclusion there was that in order for a subject rationally to hope that P must, for all she knows, be metaphysically possible. Kant's claim in the canon here goes further in that it requires the subject to have a certain positive propositional attitude, even if only implicitly. So it looks like his principle is this H star. S's hope that P is rational only if S at least rationally believes, in Kant's technical sense, that P is really possible. So it's not that it's for all you know or for all you're justified in believing that it's possible, it's that you actually have to have this belief that it is really possible. Although they're consistent, the difference between H and H star is crucial.